She was there every single night, at every dinner, every ball, every event where his name opened doors and his presence filled rooms. She was there, beside him, behind him, never quite with him, and no one noticed, because she smiled the right way, stood the right distance, said the right things to the right people at exactly the right moment. She was the perfect Duchess. She was completely alone. And then, one Tuesday, she simply stopped showing up. No argument, no scene. No letter left on his pillow with trembling handwriting. She just disappeared from the edges of his world. And he didn't notice. Not that Tuesday. Not the week after. Not until he walked into the most important ballroom of the season, stood in the center of 300 people, and felt, for the first time in 2 years, that something was wrong. The music was playing. The chandeliers were lit. The room was full. But the one person who had never once asked him for anything, the one person who had stayed quietly, patiently, invisibly, was gone. And the room knew it before he did. This is the story of a man who had everything and only understood what he had when he finally felt what he'd lost. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people who were supposed to see you, this story was made for you. Hit subscribe right now, so you never miss a story like this one. We publish new stories every week, and every single one is built to make you feel something real. Now, let's begin. The chandeliers were lit, the music was soft, and Ilara Voss stood at the entrance of the Grand Hartwell ballroom in a gown the color of winter roses, her gloved hand resting on the arm of the most powerful man in the room, her husband, the Duke of Ashford. To everyone watching, they were the perfect portrait of nobility. To her, it was just another evening of pretending. She had learned in 2 years of marriage how to smile without feeling it, how to nod at the right moment, laugh at the right joke, and disappear gracefully into the background while he moved through the crowd like he owned every breath of air in the place, because in many ways he did. The Duke of Ashford was magnetic, deliberate, and utterly unreachable, and Ilara had stopped reaching. What no one saw, not the ladies with their fans, not the gentlemen with their glasses of port, was the moment he turned away from her to greet Lady Constance Hale without so much as a glance back. Ilara stood alone for exactly 4 minutes before a kind older countess took pity and offered conversation. 4 minutes, she counted. She always counted, because counting was easier than feeling. The Duke of Ashford, Edmund Voss, was not a cruel man. That was the part that made everything harder. He never raised his voice, never embarrassed her publicly, never did any of the things that would have given her a clean, simple reason to feel what she felt. He was simply elsewhere, even when he was standing right beside her. In the mornings he left before she woke. In the evenings he returned after she had already dined alone. Their conversations, when they happened, were brief and functional. A mention of an upcoming engagement, a question about the household accounts, a polite good night that sounded more like a business closing than a husband speaking to his wife. She had once tried to ask him about his day. He had answered in 3 sentences and returned to his correspondence. The staff admired him. His peers respected him. The newspapers called him a man of great character and quiet strength, and all of that was probably true. But none of it explained why, in a house with 40 rooms, Ilara had never once felt less alone than when she was standing in the garden by herself, talking to the roses she had planted in the spring. The ones he had never once noticed were there. It started small. A dinner where he sat beside Lady Constance because the hostess had arranged the seating. A theatre evening where his cousin claimed the chair on his left. a charity luncheon where he arrived separately and never quite made his way to her side of the room. Each time, there was a reason. Each time, the reason was reasonable, and each time Ilara told herself it meant nothing. But then it became a pattern, and patterns, unlike individual moments, are very hard to explain away. She began to notice that when he wanted company, he sought it elsewhere, in the laughter of old friends, in the sharp wit of his business associates, in the easy comfort of people he had chosen, as opposed to the woman he had been contractually bound to. She was never excluded. She was simply never included. She tried once to suggest they arrive together at Lord Pemberton's autumn reception. A small thing, an ordinary thing, the kind of thing married couples did without thinking. He had agreed with a nod, then sent word an hour before that he would be going ahead with his secretary to review some matter of estate business. She had arrived alone again and spent the evening near the window, watching him across the room, laughing at something she would never hear. It was Lady Constance Hale who first made the whispers loud enough to hear. She was everything the gossip columns celebrated, tall, confident, impeccably dressed, with a laugh that carried across a ballroom and a family name that opened every door in London. She was also increasingly the woman standing where Ilara was supposed to be. No one said anything directly. That was not how society worked. Instead, they said things like how charming she is, and the Duke seems so at ease with her, and what a natural presence at his side, all in tones carefully calibrated to be heard by exactly the right people. Ilara heard them. She was always near enough to hear, and always far enough away that no one felt the need to lower their voice. The cruelest part was that Lady Constance was not malicious. She was simply present in all the ways Ilara had stopped being. She laughed freely. She touched his arm when she spoke. She leaned in when he said something quiet, as if every word from him deserved her full attention. Ilara had done all of those things once. She had simply stopped when she realized none of them made any difference, and apparently no one had noticed the moment she did. There was an evening at the Wyndham Gallery, an art showing, champagne, soft string music in the corner, where Ilara watched her husband be a different man. She watched him compliment an elderly painter with genuine warmth. She watched him crouch down to speak to a young boy who had wandered in with his governess, making the child laugh with something whispered and kind. She watched him give a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes, to no fewer than 7 people in the span of 1 hour. He had not smiled at her like that in months. She could not remember the last time. She tried, standing there with a glass of champagne growing warm in her hand, to trace back through her memory to find the last genuine moment between them. Not polite, not functional, not performed for an audience. She could not find it. And the not finding was worse than she expected. She left the gallery early, telling no one. Her carriage was brought around, and she sat in the dark on the ride home, not crying, she had moved past crying, but simply sitting with the quiet weight of a truth she had been avoiding for a long time. Her husband was capable of warmth. He was capable of presence, of attention, of the small beautiful gestures that made people feel seen. He simply did not direct any of it toward her, and she was finally fully done pretending that didn't matter. There was a particular Tuesday in November when Ilara made a decision so quiet that no one in the house would have noticed it. Not the butler, not the maids, not the man reading correspondence in the study down the hall. She decided to stop, not to leave, not to confront, not to demand, simply to stop extending herself towards someone who had never once moved in her direction. It had begun with small requests: a walk together on Sunday mornings, a shared dinner without guests, a single evening where she did not feel like furniture in her own home. Each request had been met with distraction, delay, or the particular brand of polite dismissal that doesn't sound like rejection until you've heard it enough times to recognize its shape. She had heard it enough times. She knew its shape by heart. The last attempt came on a rainy Wednesday when she had left a book on his desk, one she had read and loved, with a small note tucked inside suggesting he might enjoy it. She never mentioned it again. He never mentioned it at all. 3 weeks later, she found it exactly where she had left it, the note still inside, undisturbed. She retrieved the book, removed the note, and placed it in the fireplace. Not in anger, in the quiet final way of someone who has just understood something they can no longer unknow. What Alara did not know, what very few people knew, was that Edmund Voss had not always been this way. There had been a version of him, years before the title and the weight of the dukedom, who had loved openly and been destroyed for it. Her name was Catherine Alden. She had been brilliant, beautiful, and entirely calculated in every gesture she ever directed at him. He had been 23. He had believed every word. And when Catherine chose a wealthier title over a younger son with only a promising future, she had left without the courtesy of honesty, letting him discover the truth at a dinner party in front of people who would remember his face for years afterward. He had rebuilt himself methodically after that, closed the doors, learned to function, learned to be admired from a distance, learned that the safest kind of marriage was one built on mutual practicality, where no one expected warmth and therefore no one could weaponize its absence. He had chosen Alara precisely because she seemed composed, sensible, and unlikely to require what he could no longer give. What he had not anticipated, what he had not allowed himself to examine, was that composed people feel everything. They simply feel it quietly, in rooms no one else enters. And by the time the cost of his walls became visible, it was already measured in 2 years of silence and a book left untouched on a desk. The first event she missed was a small one, a Thursday evening reception at the Belmore estate. She sent her apologies with a note citing a mild indisposition. No one questioned it. The second was a weekend luncheon hosted by Viscountess Hartley. Again a polite note. Again, no questions. By the third absence, the pattern was established, and Alara found that the world did not in fact stop turning when she was not present in it. What she did instead was simpler and more nourishing than any ballroom had ever been. She read by the window in the mornings. She walked in the garden at an hour when the house was still. She had quiet dinners with her younger sister, who visited twice and noticed immediately that something had shifted, but was wise enough not to push. Alara was not happy, not yet, but she was no longer performing, and the relief of that was something she hadn't expected to feel so deeply. Edmund noticed the empty chair at the Belmore reception, the way one notices a small change in a familiar painting. Something is different, but the eye takes time to find it. He asked his secretary if the Duchess had sent word. The secretary confirmed she had. Edmund nodded and returned to his conversation. He did not think about it again that evening, but somewhere beneath the conversation and the port and the practiced ease of a man entirely in his element, something small and unnamed had shifted, though it would be weeks before he understood what it was. London society had a particular appetite for absence. A presence could be explained, categorized, filed away. But an absence, especially a duchess's absence, invited speculation the way open windows invite wind. By the fourth missed event, the whispers had found their shape. By the sixth, they had found an audience. The version Edmund heard came from Lord Harwick, delivered over brandy with the careful casualness of someone who wanted to seem uninvested in the information he was conveying. People are beginning to talk, Ashford. They're saying the Duchess has retired from society entirely, Some say the marriage is in difficulty. Others are less kind in their interpretation. Edmund had received the words with his usual composure, responded with something measured and dismissive, and changed the subject with the efficiency of a man who had long ago mastered the art of ending conversations he didn't want to have. But the words stayed with him on the carriage ride home, not because of what society thought. He had never particularly cared about that. They stayed because they forced him to count. How many events had she missed? He tried to recall and found to his discomfort that he could not produce an accurate number. He had not been keeping track. He had not noticed the accumulation, only the individual instances, each of which had seemed, at the time, entirely unremarkable. It was only as a sum that they became something else entirely. He began to notice the house differently. It happened gradually, the way light changes in a room when a curtain is drawn. Not a sudden darkness, but a slow, unmistakable shift. The piano in the east sitting room had been silent for 3 weeks. He had walked past it every morning without registering the silence until one evening it struck him with unexpected force, and he stopped in the doorway and simply stood there, listening to the absence of music. The tea service in the morning room, the small blue one she favored, was no longer set out on the side table. The window at the end of the corridor that she always left slightly open, regardless of the season, claiming the house needed to breathe, had been closed for days. The roses in the garden, the ones she had planted the previous spring in the far corner near the iron gate, had been carefully trimmed and tended. But he had not seen her in the garden. He could not remember the last time he had. These were small things. Objectively, entirely small things, and yet they accumulated in his chest with a weight that surprised him, not because they were large, but because they revealed the shape of something he had been looking at for 2 years, without ever truly seeing it. She had been present in this house in 100 quiet ways, and now those ways were disappearing, one by one, like candles being extinguished in a room he had never thought to enter, until the dark made it impossible to ignore. The Cavendish Winter Ball was the most anticipated event of the season. 300 guests, an orchestra imported from Vienna, and the kind of collective elegance that London society assembled once a year to remind itself of its own importance. Edmund arrived with his usual composure, exchanged the expected pleasantries at the door, and moved into the room with the practiced ease of a man who had attended 100 events exactly like this one. And then something stopped him. Not a sound, not a face, not anything he could point to and name. It was more like a frequency, the way a room hums differently when something essential has been removed from it. He stood near the center of the ballroom, a glass in hand, conversation flowing around him, and felt with a clarity that was almost physical that something was wrong. Not wrong in the way of crisis or danger, wrong in the way of a chord played with a missing note, technically present, functionally incomplete. He scanned the room once, then again, and then understood. He was looking for her, not consciously, not deliberately, but his eyes had been moving through the crowd in the particular pattern of someone searching for a familiar point of reference, and the point of reference was not there. Ilara was not in the room, and the room, without her quiet presence at its edges, felt like a sentence that had lost its final word. He finished his glass. He did not enjoy the evening, and on the carriage ride home he did not read, did not think about business, did not do any of the things he normally did. He simply sat in the dark, and for the first time in a very long time, he let himself wonder. He did not go to her directly. That was not how Edmund Voss operated. Instead, he began to observe, quietly, carefully, the way he approached every problem he did not yet fully understand. He started paying attention to the details he had previously moved past without registering, and what he found disturbed him in ways he was not prepared for. She took her breakfast alone, always at the same small table by the east window, with a book open beside her plate that she rarely seemed to actually read. She spent her afternoons in the garden or the library, moving through the house with the unhurried quiet of someone who had made peace with solitude, not as a temporary condition, but as a permanent arrangement. She did not seek him out. She did not avoid him either. When they crossed paths, she was courteous, composed, and entirely unreachable in a way that had nothing to do with coldness and everything to do with distance that had been chosen deliberately over time. He watched her one evening from the doorway of the library. She did not see him, sitting with a book in her lap and the firelight on her face, and he tried to remember the last time he had sat in the same room with her simply because he wanted to. He could not find the memory. It wasn't there, and the absence of it felt less like a gap in his recollection and more like an indictment, quiet, thorough, and entirely deserved. It was Mrs. Holt, the housekeeper, a woman of 30 years in service and precisely zero tolerance for pretense, who finally said what no one else had been willing to say. She did not do it dramatically. She did it the way she did everything, directly without embellishment, while reviewing the household accounts with him on a grey Friday morning. "If I may, Your Grace," she had said it in the tone that meant she was going to say it regardless. "The Duchess has been having her meals alone for 4 months. She has declined every social invitation that arrived in the past 6 weeks. She has not asked for anything, not the carriage, not the seamstress, not even additional coal for her sitting room, though the nights have been cold. She manages everything quietly and asks for nothing. I mention it only because, in my experience, when a woman of her temperament stops asking for things entirely, it is not because she has everything she needs." Edmund had sat with that for a long moment. Then he had thanked Mrs. Holt, closed the accounts, and gone to stand at the window of his study for a very long time. What the housekeeper had described was not a woman at peace. It was a woman who had concluded, through accumulated evidence, that wanting things in this house led nowhere, and had adjusted herself accordingly. He had built a marriage so devoid of warmth that his wife had learned to need nothing from it. And the most damning part was that it had taken a servant's quiet observation to make him see it. Elara had not made the decision dramatically. There had been no single breaking point, no final argument, no moment of operatic clarity. There had simply been a morning, an ordinary Tuesday, pale light through the curtains, the distant sound of the house waking up, when she had sat at the edge of her bed and understood, with the calm certainty of someone who has finished grieving, that she was going to leave. Not immediately, not in anger, but she was going to leave. She had begun making arrangements in the methodical, unhurried way that characterized everything she did. A letter to her sister, a quiet conversation with her solicitor about a small property she had inherited from her grandmother, a gradual reduction of her presence in the shared spaces of the house that was less withdrawal and more preparation. She was not punishing him. She was simply finally at long last choosing herself. Her trunks were not packed, not yet. But in her mind, she had already begun to let go of the rooms. The east window where she took her breakfast, the garden corner with the roses, the library with the fireplace that crackled on cold evenings. She had loved this house, genuinely loved it, in the way one loves a place that has held both happiness and sorrow in equal measure. But love for a house was not sufficient reason to remain in a marriage that had asked everything of her and returned almost nothing. She had given it 2 years. She had given it every quiet, patient, unacknowledged effort she had. And now she was ready to give herself something instead. He came to the library on a Thursday evening without entirely knowing why. He had told himself it was to retrieve a specific volume, a reasonable justification, the kind his mind produced efficiently when his instincts were moving faster than his logic. But the book he named to himself was not on the shelf he went to first. He went, without thinking, to the chair by the fire, her chair, the one where he had seen her reading, alone on 100 evenings he had spent elsewhere. She was there. She looked up when he entered, not startled, not pleased, simply present in the composed, self-contained way she had perfected over 2 years. She offered a small, courteous smile and returned to her book, clearly expecting him to retrieve whatever he had come for and leave. That was the pattern. That was what always happened. He retrieved something, exchanged a brief pleasantry, and the evening continued as separately as it had begun. But he did not leave. He stood near the doorway for a moment that stretched longer than was comfortable, and then, without any of the deliberateness that defined him, he crossed the room and sat down in the chair opposite her. Not his usual chair, not the chair at the desk, but the one directly across from hers, close enough that the firelight reached them both. She looked up again, and this time the composure flickered. Just slightly, just for a moment, because this was not the pattern. He had never done this. And somewhere beneath the careful stillness of her expression, something that had almost finished dying held its breath, waiting to see what he would do next. He did not begin with an apology. He was not yet capable of that, not because he lacked remorse, but because the remorse was so large and so unfamiliar that he had not yet found the edges of it. What he said instead was smaller, and perhaps more honest for being so. He said, "I noticed the piano has been silent." Ilara looked at him for a long moment. The firelight moved between them. She closed her book slowly with the particular care of someone buying themselves a breath of time, and then she said, very quietly, "Yes." I stopped playing. She did not explain why. She did not need to. They both understood that the piano had not stopped because her fingers had forgotten the keys. It had stopped because music is an offering, and she had run out of reasons to offer things to an empty room. He stayed for 2 hours that evening. He did not say everything. He was not built for everything, not yet. But he said enough. He said he had noticed the roses. He said he had noticed the window. He said haltingly, in the way of a man unaccustomed to admitting vulnerability, that he had stood in the Cavendish ballroom 3 weeks prior and felt, for the first time, what his own indifference had actually cost. She listened without interrupting. She did not cry. She did not soften visibly. But when he finally went quiet, she looked at him with the steady, clear gaze of a woman who has decided to hear the truth before deciding what to do with it, and that, he understood, was more than he had earned. She did not give him her answer that night. She slept on it, not restlessly, not with the anxious turning of someone torn between 2 equal options, but with the deliberate calm of someone who already knew what she needed and was simply ensuring that the words, when they came, would be precise. She found him at breakfast the following morning, the first time she had done so in months, and she sat down across from him with the composure of a woman who had rehearsed nothing and needed to rehearse nothing, because she was simply telling the truth. She told him that she had spent 2 years adjusting herself to the shape of his absence, that she had made herself smaller, quieter, less present, believing that if she demanded less, she would eventually be given something. She told him that strategy had failed completely and that she was not willing to return to it. Then she told him what she required, not a performance of affection, not grand gestures designed for an audience. What she required was presence, real, consistent, unglamorous presence. Breakfast occasionally, a conversation that was not functional, the simple acknowledgement in private and in public that she was his wife, and not an arrangement he had made and subsequently filed away. She told him she was not asking him to become someone he was not. She was asking him to decide, with full awareness of what it cost her when he didn't, whether she was worth the effort of trying. Then she poured her tea and waited, with extraordinary patience, for him to answer. He did not answer with words. He answered with Tuesday. He was at breakfast on Tuesday, not announced, not explained, simply there, with a newspaper he did not read because he was paying attention to her instead. He asked about the book she was currently reading. She told him. He asked a question about it that revealed he had been listening more carefully than she had assumed. It was a small thing. It was an enormous thing. If this story is already making you feel something, you're exactly who this channel was built for. Subscribe to Dukedom Stories so the next chapter of someone's life finds you before anyone else. And if you know someone who has ever loved quietly, waited patiently, and deserved so much more, share this video with them right now. Because some stories don't just entertain. They remind people that they were never as invisible as they believed. Now, let's keep going. Because the room is about to feel very, very wrong. The weeks that followed were not a fairy tale. There were mornings he was absent again. Habit is not dismantled in a single decision, and evenings where the old distance crept back into the spaces between them like cold air under a door. But the difference now was that he noticed when it happened, and noticing she was learning was the beginning of everything. He began to appear in the garden on Saturday afternoons, not to garden, not to do anything purposeful, simply to be in the same space where she was. He sat on the stone bench near the iron gate and read while she tended the roses, and they spoke intermittently, in the easy, unforced way of people who are slowly becoming comfortable with each other. He came to the piano one evening and asked her to play. She looked at him carefully, searching for the performance in it, the obligation, the polite request designed to be declined. She found none of those things. She found only a man sitting in a chair by the window, genuinely waiting. So she played, not a showpiece, not something impressive, but a quiet melody she loved and had never played for anyone. He listened without speaking, without moving, for the entire piece. When she finished, he said only, "That was beautiful." And for the first time in longer than she could easily measure, she believed him. It was not a dramatic morning. The sky was the flat, pale grey of early spring, and the garden was just beginning to show the first tentative colour of the season. Small green shoots pushing through the dark soil near the iron gate, a suggestion of what was coming rather than the thing itself. Elara stood at the east window with her tea and looked at the garden and understood, quietly and completely, that she was not leaving. It had not been a single moment that changed her mind. It had been an accumulation, the same way the damage had accumulated, but in reverse. Tuesday breakfasts, Saturday afternoons on the stone bench, the evening with the piano. A night, 2 weeks prior, when she had mentioned offhandedly that the roses in the far corner needed new soil, and had come down the following morning to find that he had already spoken to the groundskeeper and arranged it. Not because it was a grand gesture, but because she had mentioned it and he had listened. That was the thing. He had started listening. Really listening, in the way that means the other person's words land somewhere and stay. She turned from the window when she heard him in the corridor, his particular step, unhurried and deliberate, and when he appeared in the doorway and saw her there, something in his expression shifted in the way it had begun to shift more frequently. A small, unguarded opening, like a window in a house that had been closed too long, letting in air. He crossed the room and stood beside her at the window and looked at the garden. "The roses are coming back," he said. She looked at him. the profile of a man who was learning slowly and imperfectly and genuinely to be present. And she said, "Yes, they are." And in those 4 words, she meant the roses, and she meant the house, and she meant herself, and she meant them. And he understood all of it. The Hartwell Spring Ball was the same ballroom where the story had begun. The same chandeliers, the same music, the same collective elegance assembled to remind itself of its own importance. Elara stood at the entrance in a gown the color of late afternoon, warm, unhurried, entirely herself. And this time, when her gloved hand rested on her husband's arm, the gesture meant something different than it had before. He did not move ahead into the crowd. He stayed beside her. When Lord Harwick approached with the particular smile of a man who had once delivered gossip and was now recalibrating his assumptions, Edmund introduced Elara first, not as my wife in the functional categorical way of a man listing his credentials, but by her name, with a quiet directness that communicated to anyone paying attention that she was not an appendage. She was the person he had come with. She was the person he intended to stay beside. Several people noticed. Lady Constance Hale noticed most of all, and said nothing, and moved gracefully to the other side of the room. There was a moment midway through the evening when the orchestra shifted into something slower, and Edmund turned to her. Not to the room, not to the social geometry of the event, but to her specifically, and offered his hand. She looked at it for exactly 1 breath. Then she took it. They moved onto the floor among the other couples, and she did not count the minutes, and she did not watch the room for signs of his attention drifting elsewhere, and she did not perform a single thing. She simply danced with her husband in a ballroom that had once made her feel invisible, and felt fully quietly without reservation that she was exactly where she had chosen to be, not where circumstance had placed her, not where obligation had kept her, where she had chosen, with open eyes and a heart that had been tested and had held, to remain, and that in the end made all the difference. The most powerful thing a woman can do in a room that has forgotten her is to stop pretending it hasn't, and wait to see if the right person finally looks up. She didn't leave with anger, she left with clarity, and she came back with choice. That's what this channel believes in. Women who survive the silence, men who finally learn to see, and love stories that are earned, not given. If this story moved you, like this video, it tells us this kind of storytelling matters. Share it with someone who needs to hear that being overlooked is never the end of the story. And subscribe to Dukedom Stories, because next week we have another story waiting for you, one that will stay with you long after it ends. Thank you for watching. Thank you for feeling. We'll see you in the next one.